I want you to picture something with me for a second. You are sitting at the head of a conference table on the 42nd floor of a building you own. The city is spread out behind you through floor-to-ceiling glass. Philadelphia on a clear November morning. All that steel and history compressed into one enormous familiar picture that you have stopped noticing the way you stopped noticing a song you've loved too long. There are 3 bottles of sparkling water on the table. Your assistant placed them there with the precise care of someone who understands that small details signal large things. The folders are arranged, the chairs are empty. The room is quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet before something important. And then the door opens. 2 men walk in. They are in their late 50s. They are wearing suits that were expensive once, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and have been maintained carefully since, because suits like that represent a level of life that the people wearing them can no longer quite afford, but are not yet ready to admit to. They are carrying the kind of nervous energy that comes when desperation has put on a jacket and told itself to behave. They sit down across from you. They look at the documents on the table. They look at the room. And then one of them, the older one, slowly lifts his eyes from the table and looks at your face. You watch the exact moment he realizes who you are. I need you to hold that image for the entire length of this story, because that moment, that single, suspended, completely silent moment, is not what this story is about. That moment is just where this story ends. What it is about is the 20 years it took to arrive there. What it is about is what those 20 years actually cost. What it is about is a farm in rural Pennsylvania, and a father and 2 brothers and a graveside, and $47 and a couch and a construction site and a library and a choice made at 19 years old that I would make again and that I will spend the rest of my life living with. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is the land, and what happened to it, and what happened to me. So let me start from the real beginning, the one that explains everything else. I grew up on a piece of land in a rural county of Pennsylvania that my grandfather had worked before my father was ever born. Not a large farm by regional standards, about 230 acres of rolling fields in the soft hills of that particular part of the state. The kind of landscape that doesn't announce itself, that you have to slow down to appreciate, that reveals its quality gradually rather than dramatically. There was a red barn that had been repainted so many times. The original color was a philosophical question. There was a main house with wide plank floors and low ceilings, and a porch that leaned slightly to the left, a lean that had been there so long it was no longer a problem but a characteristic. There was a creek that ran along the southern edge of the property and flooded every April without any consultation with our preferences on the matter. It was not a prosperous farm. I want to say that clearly and without apology. It was a farm that survived, that persisted, that continued producing because a certain kind of person lived on it and understood that survival was not a minimum condition, but a genuine achievement. There is a real difference between a farm that thrives and a farm that endures, and if you have ever lived close to land and people who work it, you understand that distinction immediately and completely. My father ran that farm with the kind of focused, wordless intensity that I have never encountered since in any boardroom or negotiation or corporate environment, and I have been in many of all 3. He was up before 4 in the morning, every morning, without exception, without complaint, with the settled inevitability of a person who has organized their entire existence around a commitment they made once and never revisited. He moved through the day with an economy of action that was, when I was young, invisible to me, and that I have spent the better part of my adult life trying to understand and replicate. He checked soil with his bare hands the way other people check the news, instinctively, constantly, as if receiving information that only he could interpret. He read weather the way some men read faces. He understood the particular logic of that land with a specificity that went beyond knowledge into something more like belonging. He had 3 sons. Blake was the oldest. Blake arrived in the world 12 years before I did, which means he was already forming his understanding of the farm and the family, and what his place in both might be before I was a concept, before I was a possibility that anyone had considered. He was, by the time I became old enough to observe him clearly, a person who wanted more than what the land offered, and wanted it with the particular urgency of someone who believes that wanting more is itself a kind of intelligence. He was sharp and sociable and ambitious, and those qualities, on the farm, translated into a restlessness that my father never quite knew what to do with. Darren was the middle brother, 9 years older than me. Darren was different from Blake in the way that middle children are sometimes different, quieter, more watchful, less declarative. He observed things before he commented on them, which would have been a strength if what he observed had been filtered through better judgment. Darren was not a leader. He was not a follower exactly. He was the kind of person who becomes whatever the dominant energy in a room requires him to be, which, when the dominant energy is his older brother, produces consequences that matter. And then there was me, the youngest, arriving when my mother was already tired from 2 boys and a farm and a husband who gave everything he had to a piece of land that gave back inconsistently, when my father was already in his late 30s and had been working for years with the specific fatigue that comes from labor that is also love. I was unexpected, I think, in the way that not all unexpected things are unwelcome, but that all unexpected things require adjustment. My father treated us differently. I need to say this plainly because the entire story depends on it being plain. Blake and Darren were not inventing that difference. They were observing it correctly. What they were wrong about, catastrophically, permanently, damage-inflictingly wrong about, was the reason for it. And the reason for it is the thing I spent the first 40 years of my life slowly understanding. My father took me to the fields when I was 6. He lifted me onto the tractor beside him and drove the rows in the particular silence of a man who doesn't need to perform a lesson to teach it, who believes that presence is the actual instruction. He showed me how the slope of the land predicted water movement, how the color of the soil in different areas indicated different compositions, how the growth pattern in a field could tell you things about what had happened there 2 and 3 seasons before. He talked to me on the porch in the evenings about crop rotation, about the history of the property, about what his own father had built here, and what he hoped would continue after him. The specific memories of those evenings with my father are precise in a way that many things from that period are not. My father sitting in the wooden chair he had used for 30 years, the armrests worn smooth by exactly that use, the sound of the crickets in the fields being something you don't notice when you live inside it, but that you discover the absence of immediately when you move away. My father's hands on the chair arms, the hands of a person who had worked physically for 40 years, large and calloused and capable hands that told the full story of a life in a single glance without editorial. He told me about my grandfather on those evenings, about how the land had been purchased in the 1930s for a price that now sounded impossible, purchased during a period when land in that part of Pennsylvania was cheap because everyone was desperate, and prices reflected desperation rather than value. My grandfather had understood that the land's value was not its current market price, but what it could produce under the right management over sufficient time. He paid almost nothing for a piece of earth that, under 30 years of consistent work, became a genuine producing farm. That is the story my father told me about value and patience and the difference between what something costs and what something is worth, and I did not understand it fully when he told me. I understood it approximately 20 years later when I was trying to explain to a junior analyst at my firm why we were paying what looked like a premium for a degraded property in a neighborhood that everyone else was undervaluing. The circle of that understanding, from a farmhouse porch in rural Pennsylvania to a corner office in Philadelphia, is the actual through line of my life, not the money, not the company, the application of one man's agricultural wisdom to an entirely different domain, carrying his logic forward into a world he never entered, honoring something he built by building something new from the same principle. He did not do those things with Blake and Darren in the same way or to the same degree. Blake was already in high school. when I was 6, already pulling away from the farm toward the future he was constructing in his imagination. Darren was not interested in the technical aspects of farming, and had made that clear in the wordless way that children make things clear to parents who are paying attention. My father read these signals accurately and responded to them with the practical logic of a person who needed someone to care about this land after him, and who saw in his youngest son a candidate. So yes, he invested in me. He invested in me out of need and love and fear, and the specific desperation of a person who has built something with their hands and wants it to survive. But Blake and Darren translated that investment into evidence of a preference they had not earned, into proof of a relationship they had been excluded from, into the foundational wound around which the rest of their relationship with me would organize itself. I want to be precise about this, because I think it matters. I did not steal anything from my brothers. I did not take a father's love that was rightfully theirs. I was a child on a farm with a father who needed someone to care about what he had built, and I was the only one of his children who was still present and young enough to be shaped by that need. The favoritism they perceived was real. The cause of it was not what they believed, but by the time I was old enough to understand the full picture, the wound had been open for so many years that no accurate accounting of its origin could close it. My mother died when I was 11. I need to say this too, because it changes the shape of everything that follows. She died in the spring from an illness that moved faster than anyone expected, that the doctors treated aggressively, and that treated their aggression with indifference, and that left my father specifically, with the particular silenced devastation of a person who has lost the only other person who understood all of what he was. Blake was 23 and living away from home by then. Darren was 20 and in his second year of college in Pittsburgh. I was 11 and still entirely at home, entirely dependent, with nothing between me and the grief of the farm but my father and the land itself. What happened after my mother died was not a conscious decision by my father to make me his companion. It was simply the mathematics of who was there. He was there, I was there. Two people in a house where the third person had been everything, in a silence that needed to be filled by something, and what filled it, over those months and years, was work and conversation, and the gradual construction of something that was not just a father-son relationship, but something more specific and more complete, the way relationships between two people who are genuinely relying on each other tend to become complete. Blake and Darren saw this from a distance. They came home for holidays, for summers in the early years when they were still in school, and they encountered a dynamic that had solidified in their absence, and that they were no longer participants in, and they interpreted that exclusion as intentional rather than circumstantial. The resentment this created was real. I am not dismissing it. I am saying that the story they told themselves about its cause was wrong, and that wrong story would eventually become the most destructive thing that ever happened to me. By the time I was 15, Blake had left for Philadelphia with his business administration degree from a state school in his back pocket, and a confidence that was running approximately 6 months ahead of his demonstrated abilities, which is not an unusual condition in ambitious 27-year-olds, and is not necessarily a permanent one. He found sales work with a mid-sized regional company, moved into an apartment he shared with 2 other young men, and began constructing a life that looked from the outside exactly like the life he had always said he wanted. Urban, professional, upwardly mobile, demonstrably not the farm. Darren followed 2 years later. He went into property management in Pittsburgh, a detail whose specific irony would take me decades to fully appreciate, working for a management company that handled commercial properties in the city's eastern neighborhoods. He was good enough at the work, consistent and reliable, which are not the same as talented, but which are sufficient for a great many careers. He rented a small apartment in a neighborhood called Shadyside and began the same project Blake had begun, the construction of a self that was separate from the farm and the family, and whatever weight those things carried. And then it was just me and my father on the 230 acres. I want to be accurate about what that period of my adolescence was. because I think there is a temptation in stories like this to present the years before the fall as either idyllic or as obviously difficult, and the truth is that it was neither. It was simply a life. I did chores and homework. I drove the old pickup on the back roads in the evening when the work was done, which in Pennsylvania in summer is very late evening. I knew the land the way you know something you have never not known, not as an object or a concept, but as a fact of your existence, as specific and unremarkable as your own height. I swam in the creek in August and helped with the harvest in fall, and spent winter evenings reading at the kitchen table, while my father read across from me in the same silence we had learned together after my mother died. School was complicated for me in the particular way that school is complicated for kids who are physically removed from the social geography of their peers, and who arrive in a building full of people whose concerns are fundamentally different from their own. I was quiet. I wore the wrong things. I did not follow the music or the sports narratives that organize social life in a regional high school in rural Pennsylvania. I did not have the vocabulary for the cultural references that circulated in the hallways and at the lunch tables. I was also, in a way I could not yet fully name, carrying something heavy, the farm and the silence in it, and the responsibility of being my father's only present witness. That made small talk feel like an effort requiring translation. But I was curious, almost excessively so. I was curious about how things worked, about structures and systems and the logic underneath surface appearances, and this curiosity expressed itself academically in a way that my teachers noticed and treated with a specific kind of attention that was new to me, and that I found cautiously encouraging. My math and science teachers in particular seemed to recognize something worth developing, and they worked at developing it with a patience that I am still, at 50 years old, grateful for. A chemistry teacher named Mrs. Henderson was the first person outside my father who ever said to me, explicitly, that I was capable of something beyond where I was. She said it after returning a lab report I had written that was considerably more thorough than what the assignment required, and she said it in the particular matter-of-fact tone of a person who considers that kind of statement too important to be ornamental, who means it as a practical observation rather than a compliment. I want to tell you about one specific incident from high school that shaped something in me I only understood much later. In my junior year, I was assigned to a group project for a history class with 3 other students. 2 of them from town, one a kid named Jeremy Iverson, whose family had a larger farm operation in the county, and who had a quiet contempt for anyone from a smaller property, expressed through dismissive comments that could be denied if challenged directly. The project was on the history of land use in our region. I knew more about this topic than anyone else in the room, including the teacher, because I had been living inside that history my entire life. But Jeremy controlled the group through social confidence and a facility for speaking first and speaking loudly, and my contributions were consistently absorbed without credit, and I sat with a specific frustration for 6 weeks that I did not know how to address. At the end of the project, when we presented to the class the research I had done, the data on crop rotation histories, the analysis of how the county's land use patterns had shifted across 3 generations, was presented as a collective contribution, and Jeremy spoke about it with the ownership of a person who believes possession is 9/10 of presentation. The teacher gave the group a collective grade. I did not confront Jeremy. I did not report the situation. I made a note of it in the mental ledger I was building of how the world actually worked, which was different in several important ways from how it was supposed to work. I filed it under a heading that I would spend the rest of my life adding entries to. The person who does the work and the person who speaks the loudest are not always the same person, and in the short term, the voice often wins. The farm graveside was the same dynamic at an order of magnitude too large to absorb in real time, but I had seen the mechanism before. I had seen it at 14 in a high school classroom and had not had the tools to respond. By the time I had the tools, it was 20 years later, and the context was a conference room and the farm was mine again. The loop closed. It just closed slowly, which is the only way real loops close. I think about her sometimes when I'm hiring for my company, about the specific effect of being told plainly and without theater that you are capable of more. It has a weight that is disproportionate to its simplicity. I started thinking about university in a serious way in my junior year. Not casually, the way some of my classmates thought about it as a default next step, but in the focused, methodical way that I had started to approach anything that required planning. I read about programs. I looked at financial aid options. I visited the guidance counselor, a well-meaning man named Mr. Davidson who seemed slightly surprised that I had done this much research independently, and who helped me identify Penn State as a realistic option given my academic record and financial situation. I applied to 3 schools. I was accepted to Penn State with a partial scholarship for civil engineering, which was the program I had chosen because it matched my understanding of how the physical world worked, with a professional category that seemed to offer genuine employment. My father, when I showed him the acceptance letter, sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. He turned the letter over once, as if there might be more information on the back. Then he poured himself a glass of whiskey. He almost never drank, so rarely that the bottle in the cabinet had been there for at least 3 years, and said, "You earned that." I've received a great many acknowledgments of achievement in my professional life. I've received awards and press coverage, and the specific validation that comes from closing a deal that other people said was too ambitious. None of those things have weighed what those 3 words weighed, because they came from a man who did not give them lightly, who did not give them at all unless they were true, and who had watched me become the person who deserved them over the course of a childhood that had required more from me than childhoods are supposed to require. I left for Penn State in August. I remember the drive as a series of thresholds crossed: the county line, then the highway, then the city limits of the university town, each one feeling slightly more irrevocable than the last, the land behind me becoming abstract as the distance grew, until it was something I was holding rather than standing on. I moved into Pennington Hall, a dormitory that smelled with great sincerity of old carpet and institutional cleaning products. I had 2 suitcases, a box of books, a laptop 3 years behind current, and $412 in a checking account that represented the entirety of my financial position. The first person I met in Pennington Hall was Felix Armstrong, who had the room 3 doors down from mine, and who was studying accounting, and who, within approximately 6 minutes of our first conversation, demonstrated the specific quality that would make him a lifelong friend. He was exactly who he appeared to be. Felix had no performance in him, no social strategy, no calculation about how he presented himself to new people. He was simply there, fully and without effort, and this quality, which I would later understand is genuinely rare, pulled me toward him immediately and completely. Felix was from Harrisburg and had 2 younger sisters and parents, who had been together for 30 years, and who called him every Sunday, and who had sent him to university with the understanding that he would return home after graduation and build a life nearby. He was not conflicted about this. He was not performing contentment with it. He actually wanted it, which was, at 18, the most settled and self-aware quality I'd ever encountered in a person my own age. He would end up staying in Philadelphia, far from Harrisburg, because life does not always accommodate the plans we make for it at 18, but he carried that groundedness with him wherever he went, and it was something I borrowed from him repeatedly in the years when my own ground felt less reliable. I also met, in the spring of my first year, a woman named Monica Caldwellson, who was studying environmental science, and who had, I thought initially, an almost aggressive level of intellectual confidence that bordered on impatience. I later understood it was neither aggression nor impatience, but simply the manner of a person who is used to thinking rigorously and has a low tolerance for conversations that don't. Monica sat next to me in a general education science course, and, within the first week, had asked me 3 questions about agricultural land use that were more sophisticated than anything my high school education had prepared me for. She was interested, genuinely interested, in the relationship between land management practices and long-term ecological outcomes, and she was one of the first people who had ever engaged with my background on a farm as a source of knowledge rather than a marker of limitation. We became close in the easy, unself-conscious way of two people who find that talking to each other is simply better than not talking to each other. I want to be accurate. I was not in love with Monica. I was engaged by her in a way that felt important and useful, and that I valued exactly as what it was: a genuine intellectual friendship, a conversation that made me better at thinking, a regular reminder that the world contained perspectives worth pursuing. She pushed back on my ideas, demanded that I defend my positions, refused to accept answers that were technically correct but experientially hollow. I became a better thinker because of those conversations. I am sure she would say the same, though with her characteristic understatement. I was building something in those first 2 years at Penn State. Something small and real and brick by brick. A version of myself that was distinct from the farm boy and the quiet kid and the grief carrier. A version that was curious and capable and belonged in that building as fully as anyone else in it. I had a work-study job in the campus library that paid for my books and prevented me from spending money I didn't have on things I didn't need. I was doing well in my courses, particularly the engineering ones, where the combination of mathematical precision and practical application aligned exactly with the way my mind worked. My professors were beginning to know my name, which at a large state university is not a small thing. I had a plan, written in a notebook in my dormitory room. Complete the degree, get a job with a civil or structural engineering firm, earn enough to eventually invest back into the farm, modernize it properly, make it viable for another generation. I had the plan mapped out in phases with rough financial milestones. I had drawn diagrams of what certain improvements to the property might look like. I was 18 years old and completely certain that if you worked carefully and thought clearly and moved forward every day, the plan would hold. What I had not included in the plan was the phone call, because you never include the phone call. It came on a Tuesday evening in March of my second year. I was sitting on my bed with my shoes still on after a study session for a structural mechanics exam, looking at my notes, when my phone buzzed on the desk. I picked it up without checking the number, assuming it was Felix calling from his room. The voice on the other end was not Felix. It was Blake. Blake had called me exactly once since I had left for university. Once on my birthday for a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and consisted primarily of him asking if I was eating enough and telling me to work hard. The fact that he was calling on a random Tuesday evening in March told me everything I needed to know before a word of explanation was given. "It's Dad," he said. "He's been diagnosed. You need to know. Congestive heart failure with complications that the cardiologist had described, apparently, as serious and progressive." My father had been having symptoms for months. Shortness of breath, episodes of dizziness, swelling in his ankles that he'd attributed to long days on his feet, and had not told anyone because that was precisely, exactly, completely who he was. The secrecy was not strategic. It was instinctive, the reflex of a man who had always dealt with hard things by dealing with them himself, who considered involving other people in his difficulties a form of burdening them that he could not justify. Blake found out because a neighbor had called him. I believe it was Oscar Patterson, though Blake never said. After my father had been taken to the county hospital following what the report called a cardiac event, Blake was angry, the tight-voiced, controlled anger of a person who has just discovered they were excluded from something important and does not want to show how excluded they feel. He told me the facts in the measured tones of a person who is being responsible about information delivery. He told me the prognosis was serious. He told me the doctors were recommending a specific care regimen. He told me that Dad would need support at home. I asked him if he was going back. There was a pause that was not long in clock time, but that contained multitudes of information. He said he was evaluating his schedule. He had a major presentation the following week. Work was genuinely complicated at this particular moment in a project. He said Darren was in a similar position. I said I understood. I hung up the phone. I sat on my bed with my shoes still on for a very long time. Here is the decision I made, and I want to tell you exactly how I arrived at it, because I have been asked about it hundreds of times over the years, and I have never found a way to explain it that satisfies everyone, including myself. I decided to go home. Not for a visit, not for a long weekend. I decided to take a leave of absence from the university where I had spent 2 years building the first version of a life I was proud of, and go back to a farm in rural Pennsylvania to take care of a man who would not ask anyone to take care of him, and to keep a piece of land alive that had no one else capable of keeping it. The decision was made in about 45 minutes. I know that seems fast for something that consequential, but I want to be honest. It did not feel like a decision that required lengthy deliberation. It felt like a problem whose solution was obvious once you had all the variables. Blake had a career he was not going to interrupt. Darren had a career he was not going to interrupt. I had 2 years of college credits and a $400 checking account, and a father who was 60 years old and sick on a farm that had sustained my family for 3 generations, and that would not sustain itself. The math was simple. What wasn't simple was what the math cost. Put it in the comments. What would you have done? And I mean really, not what you think a good person should do, not the answer that looks best from the outside, but what you actually think you would have done at 19 with a library job and a plan in a notebook and a phone call on a Tuesday night. Because the people who have answered this question for me have split almost exactly in half, and I find both halves completely understandable, and I would not judge anyone for either answer. I drove to the farm on a Thursday. I remember the specific texture of that drive. 3 hours on roads I had traveled my whole life, the landscape around me, changing from the relative density of a university town to the openness of the county I had grown up in, the quality of the air different even through a closed car window, or maybe that's a memory imposing itself backward. The farmhouse appeared around the last curve before the property line, smaller than it lived in my memory. The porch still leaned to the left. The barn needed paint. There was a section of the east fence that had fallen and hadn't been fixed. My father was in the living room chair when I came through the door. He looked smaller than I remembered. This is the thing I want to say clearly because it is the thing that hit me hardest. My father was a large man, not in height exactly, but in presence, in the sense he projected of containing enormous capability. And what illness does to a man like that is miniaturize him, shrink the presence away from the physicality, and what remained in that chair was the physical man, the actual body, smaller than the memory of the man it contained. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You didn't have to do this." I said, "I know." He said, "Your brothers." I said, "I know, Dad." He didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need him to. We both knew what was at the end of it. The first week back, I spent doing 3 things in parallel, understanding that all 3 were urgent, and that urgency could not be allocated sequentially. I met with his medical team, specifically his cardiologist, a careful and thorough woman who laid out the situation without softening it in ways that were not useful. The condition was manageable but not reversible. It was degenerative in its nature, which meant good periods would be followed by worse periods, and the overall trajectory was downward. The medications he required were specific and needed to be taken consistently and monitored. Physical exertion was to be avoided. Stress, and here she looked at me in the way that doctors look at you when they know they're saying something the person they're talking to cannot fully control, was to be minimized. Simultaneously, I walked the entire property. It took me parts of 2 days because 230 acres is a considerable amount of ground when you're walking it with assessment eyes rather than habitual ones. I made a list in a notebook, the same kind of notebook I had used at university, the habit of documentation having taken root, of everything that needed attention. The list was 11 pages long, equipment that needed servicing, fencing repairs in 3 separate locations, drainage issues in the north field that had been partially addressed and were getting worse, a section of the barn roof with compromised structural integrity, crops that had been incompletely planned for the coming season because my father had been managing the symptoms of his illness for months before his hospitalization, and his planning had suffered accordingly. The third thing I did was sit at the kitchen table with his financial records and try to understand what the actual numbers were. My father did not manage his finances digitally. He had a filing cabinet in the spare room with folders labeled in his handwriting, and I went through those folders over the better part of an evening. The checking account had a little over $3,000 in it. The farm had a small operating loan, whose balance was manageable but whose monthly payment was not negligible. The equipment loan was larger. The property taxes were current. The medication costs, when I calculated them based on the prescriptions the doctor had given me, were going to run approximately $400 per month minimum. $3,000, 11 pages of problems, $400 a month in medications alone. The medications were the first real crisis to solve. The cardiologist had prescribed 4 separate medications with specific timing requirements. The total monthly cost, without any assistance, was $418. My father's pension was approximately $900 per month. The farm's operating costs, including the existing equipment loan payment, ran approximately $1,400 in a baseline month. The arithmetic was immediate and brutal. $900 in, $1,818 out. We were running a $900 monthly deficit with $3,000 in the account. 3,000 divided by 900 is 3 months. That was the runway. Before I made a single decision about crops or equipment, I spent 2 full days on the phone working through pharmaceutical assistance programs, Medicare supplemental options, county assistance programs, and the manufacturer programs that most people never know exist. I made approximately 30 calls. I left voicemails on 17 of them. I got through to real people on 13. By the end of those 2 days, I had identified a combination of programs that reduced the medication costs from $418 to approximately $112 per month, which was survivable in a way that $418 was not. I tell you this because it was my first genuine professional success. Not a glamorous one. Not the kind anyone would put in a press release, but the ability to research a complex system under time pressure and find the non-obvious solution within it is a skill. I developed it sitting at a kitchen table with a notepad and a telephone, and I used that same skill in different forms for the rest of my professional life, finding financing structures that other people's conventional analysis missed, identifying regulatory pathways that other people didn't know existed, approaching deal structures with the same comprehensive patient research that those 30 phone calls required. The skill was identical across those contexts. Only the application changed. The second thing I did was address the equipment situation without spending money I didn't have. The tractor was months overdue for a service. Taking it to the dealer would have cost approximately $1,100. Instead, I pulled the service manual from the equipment shed, found the relevant procedures, ordered parts from a wholesale supplier at roughly a third of the dealer's pricing, and did the service myself over 3 days. Total cost, $220. I saved $880 and learned the mechanical systems at a level of detail that would prevent future problems, because now I understood what to listen for. The ability to solve a problem yourself when the paid solution is beyond your current means, and to do it without creating secondary problems, is foundational in a way that formal education does not teach, and that a great many otherwise talented people never develop. I have hired people over the years with impressive credentials who, when presented with a constraint, could only conceive of solutions requiring resources they didn't currently have. And I have hired people without impressive credentials who responded to the same constraint by immediately inventorying available resources and thinking through non-standard applications. The second category is, in my experience, reliably more valuable. The constraint is the teacher, and it only teaches the people who are willing to sit with it long enough to learn. I called Blake that night and laid out the numbers clearly, without editorializing. I told him what we were working with. I told him what the monthly medication cost would be. I asked if he could help cover the first month, while I figured out the income side of the farm. He said he would see what he could do. He sent $200 via an app transfer the following week. That was the only financial contribution either of my brothers made to the farm or to our father's care in the 5 years that followed. I'm not saying this to generate sympathy. I am saying it as a documented fact, as data, because the pattern it represents is important for understanding everything that came after. I planted that spring alone. I had worked beside my father for years and understood the work at a level that was sufficient. But there is a categorical difference between working beside someone who is making decisions and being the person who makes the decisions yourself. The difference is the weight of consequence. When I planted 3 acres more of one crop than I should have, a miscalculation I made in late April, based on a pricing projection I'd gotten slightly wrong, there was no one to catch it before it became a problem. When I underestimated the fuel costs for the season by nearly 30%, a rookie error that a more experienced farmer would have anticipated, there was no adjustment available. When I sold the first batch of winter corn at the wrong moment, $2 below the price I should have gotten because I was watching cash flow too anxiously to hold the grain for the better window, the loss was real, and it was mine. But I also learned in that first season at a rate that compressed years of normal experience into months. Necessity sharpens attention in ways that instruction cannot replicate. When every decision carries a direct financial consequence that affects your ability to buy your father's medication, you develop a relationship to decision-making that is not available to people for whom the stakes are lower. By the end of that first summer, I understood the crop economics of our land better than I had understood anything since the structural mechanics I had been studying when the phone call came. By the end of that first year, I had the farm producing, not profitably, but producing, with a cash flow that covered medications, basic operations, and the loan payments. I had also established 3 relationships that would matter. The first was with the feed store in the nearest town, where a man named Colin Patterson, no relation to Oscar, had been doing business with my father for years, and who extended me the kind of informal credit arrangement that is only available in small rural communities where everyone's reputation is their actual currency. The second was with a grain buyer about 40 miles away who offered reasonable prices for consistent suppliers, and who, once I had demonstrated over 2 seasons that I was consistent, became a reliable outlet. The third and most important was with Oscar Patterson himself. Oscar owned the property directly to our south. He had known my father for 35 years. He was in his early 70s at the time I came back, still physically capable, but taking his days at a pace that his age had negotiated with his ambition, and he appeared on our south fence line on a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after I returned, with no stated purpose and simply watched me working in the adjacent field for a while. Then he called over to ask if I needed help with the fence section that had come down. I said I did. He came over. We fixed the fence. We went inside and had coffee, and from that point on, Oscar Patterson came to our property twice a week, always without announcement, always with something useful, a part he'd picked up, information about a buyer, a bag of seed he'd gotten too much of, sometimes just time and conversation. He never offered money. I believe this was a deliberate choice, an understanding that financial help from a neighbor is a different kind of transaction than financial help from family, and that the wrong kind of help can cost the receiver more in dignity than it provides in resource. What he offered instead was knowledge and time, and both of those things were, in the actual arithmetic of what I needed, more valuable than money would have been. He would sit with my father and me on the evenings when my father was strong enough to be on the porch, and they would talk about the land, about the history of the farms in the county, about the prices in decades past, about neighbors who had sold and the ones who had held on, and what the difference between those 2 choices had produced. Those evenings were something. I kept them the way you keep the things that sustain you when other things are falling, not consciously, not as a practice, but the way valuable things get kept, by use. The social isolation of those years was its own particular education, and I want to describe it accurately because I think people underestimate what sustained isolation does to a person's relationship with their own judgment. When you are the only adult in a situation, when every decision you make has no one to review it, question it, or catch your errors before they become expensive, you develop either inflated confidence in your own judgment or excessive anxiety about it, and neither of those outcomes is fully healthy. I developed both at different periods of those 5 years, oscillating between them in a way that was exhausting and that left me, by the 4th year, in a state of quiet chronic uncertainty about whether I was doing any of this correctly at all. The winter months were the hardest. Summer and fall kept the work constant enough that there wasn't extended space for self-examination. But Pennsylvania winters on a farm are long and quiet in ways that create too much of that space, and in that space I thought about the version of my life that was happening without me. My classmates at Penn State finishing their degrees and building the social infrastructure of young adulthood, while I was checking soil temperatures in February and reading medication interaction warnings in the kitchen at midnight. I thought about whether the plan in the notebook was truly recoverable or whether the engineering degree and city version of my future had simply closed, permanently, replaced by this. I did not allow myself to stay in those thoughts for long stretches, not because I had resolved the underlying anxiety, but because staying in them was not productive, and I had learned, through necessity, to treat my own attention as a resource to be managed deliberately. When I caught myself in extended, unproductive thought, I did something physical, got up, walked the south fence, drove out to the far field, anything that required me to be in my body and my specific location rather than in the abstractions that the long winter nights produced. But the isolation affected me in ways I didn't fully understand until I was out of it. I developed habits of self-reliance that were useful but that made asking for help, even when help was available and appropriate, feel like a failure of capacity. I developed a wariness of people's intentions that was adaptive in the context of what my brothers were doing, but that extended beyond that context into territory I would spend years working to contain. I became someone who was fully, completely capable of being alone, which is not the same as being comfortable alone, and the confusion between those two states is something I am still working on at 51. The one thing that pierced the isolation reliably and completely was the time with my father. The evenings when he was strong enough to be present, to talk, to engage with the full quality of the man he had always been. Those evenings were a form of nutrition that kept me functional in ways I did not appreciate until they stopped. And then his final year had that different quality I described. The settling, the body releasing its grip on the effort of staying, the waking periods shortening and the sleeping ones lengthening. He talked about my brothers more in that final year than he had in years. Not with anger, I want to be precise about this, because it would be easy to construct a narrative in which my father saw through them clearly and condemned them, and that is not what happened. He talked about them with the complicated love of a parent who has not succeeded in giving a child what they needed, and who carries that weight permanently. He said once, on a late September afternoon, when he was more lucid than he had been in days, that he wished he had been better at explanation when Blake and Darren were young, that he had never been good at saying things directly, and that this was a failure he recognized too late. I said I didn't think the problem was explanation. He said, maybe not. He looked out the window at the fields for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, you'll be okay. Not as comfort, as an assessment, as the conclusion of a man who had evaluated the situation carefully and was delivering his finding. I said, I know. That was the last conversation we had that carried the full weight of both of us in it. Everything after that was presence rather than exchange, me there, him there, the farm, continuing around us. And then it was just me there. Let me tell you what those 5 years actually looked like in their day-to-day reality, because I am aware that sacrifice, when described in general terms, acquires a cinematic quality that it absolutely does not have when you are inside it. When you are inside it, sacrifice is the alarm before 4 in the morning that you set, because you have to be in the field before the heat of the day makes certain work inefficient. It is the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with the bank statement and the credit card statement, and the medication cost and the equipment payment and the math that does not add up, and that you have to make add up anyway, because the alternative is not having the medication. It is the specific exhaustion of physical farm labor combined with the specific exhaustion of caring for a parent in decline. The medication management, the doctor's appointments, the nights when something shifts and you are up at 3 in the morning waiting to understand whether this shift is the kind that passes or the kind that doesn't. It is also watching your father decline over 5 years, which is a particular kind of sustained grief. Not the sudden concentrated grief of a loss you couldn't anticipate, but the slow, incremental, daily process of watching someone diminish. There were good periods. Months when his energy returned to something close to what it had been, when he could walk the near fields again, when the medication balance was right and the color came back to his face. And there were bad periods that erased the progress of the good ones. The overall direction was never in doubt. Blake visited twice in the first year. Darren visited once. They sat with my father at the kitchen table and talked to him about their lives. Blake about a new project at work, Darren about changes in the property management company he worked for. They were not unkind, they were not explicitly absent, but there was a quality to their presence that I can only describe as tourism. They came, observed, felt they had fulfilled an obligation, and left. After the first year, Blake came for Christmas and stayed 4 days. After the second year, the visits became annual events, predictable and brief, conducted with the efficiency of people managing an obligation on a calendar. The calls from Darren were more frequent but less substantial. He called every 2 weeks, asked approximately the same questions in approximately the same order, received my answers, offered opinions about what I might try differently, and hung up. He had the specific communication style of a person who wants to stay in information without being in contact, who wants to know what's happening without being subject to what's happening. I understood this for what it was and filed it accordingly. What I did not understand, what was invisible to me for years, because I was not in a position to see it, was what my brothers were building in the spaces between their visits. While I was in the fields before dawn and at the kitchen table after midnight and at the pharmacy and the doctor's office and the feed store, Blake and Darren were conducting a very different kind of campaign in the community around our farm. The community was real in the way that small rural communities are real, interconnected, attentive, invested in its own narrative about the people who belong to it. My father had been part of that community for his entire life. His illness was known and discussed. His situation, the youngest son who had come home, who was running the farm, who sat with him every day while the older sons were in the city, was visible and commented upon. In a community like that, visible situations generate narratives. The question is only who shapes the narrative first. My brothers were shaping it first, carefully, over months and years. In conversations I was never party to, I know this, because Oscar eventually told me, in the second year I was back in Philadelphia after leaving the farm, in a conversation he'd clearly been preparing for some time. He told me that Blake, on his visits, had developed a habit of stopping in at the store, at the diner, at the gas station, and having the kind of casual, friendly conversations that look like catching up and that are actually information delivery. He expressed worry about our father. He said things like, "I just hope he's being treated right," and "I know he'd never say anything if something wasn't right. That's just how he is," and "I worry sometimes about what's happening with the pension money." He said these things lightly, with apparent reluctance, as a person shares something difficult because he has no choice, and the lightness was the technique. Darren's version was quieter but consistent. He said less but confirmed more. When someone at the hardware store expressed concern about how our father seemed lately, Darren would nod slowly and say something like, "Yeah, I'm worried too. He won't talk about it directly. You know how he is." The unspoken half of that sentence, the half that people filled in themselves, was the half that mattered. Together they constructed, over 2 full years, a community understanding that what was happening at the farm was not a son caring for a sick father, but a son exploiting a vulnerable one. They built this understanding without making explicit accusations, without providing verifiable claims, without creating anything that could be directly challenged. They built it with implications and sighs and reluctant concerns. And it worked. I want to describe the mechanics of what my brothers did more specifically, because I think there is a tendency to describe manipulation in vague terms that make it sound either more mysterious or more dramatic than it actually is. What Blake and Darren did was not mysterious. It was a patient, systematic application of social dynamics that most people understand intuitively, but rarely see named as the technique it is. Blake was the architect and Darren was the distributor. Blake understood people's fears and desires better than he understood most things, and the fear that a rural community has about a son mistreating a vulnerable parent is one of the oldest and most reliable fears there is. It touches something fundamental: the disruption of the natural order, the betrayal of care, the exploitation of weakness by someone who was trusted with it. A community like ours, small and interconnected, and built on the idea that people look after each other, is particularly susceptible to this specific narrative because it violates the values that the community understands itself to be built on. Blake did not announce any of this. He performed concern. He performed reluctant disclosure. He performed the specific discomfort of a man who has to say something hard, because the alternative is to say nothing while something bad continues. He was very good at this performance because he was, in certain ways, a genuine person. He actually worried about things. He actually felt concern when he thought about difficult situations, and he used that authentic emotional texture as a carrier for information that was not accurate. The performance was convincing because it was not entirely performance. The feeling was real. The content was fabricated. The specific claims he made were that I had been collecting my father's pension checks and keeping them rather than using them for the farm and his care. That I had told my father, on at least 2 occasions, that if he complained about anything to neighbors or the doctor, I would put him in a facility. That there were concerns about the way the farm assets were being managed that suggested I was directing resources toward my own benefit rather than the farm's operations. That I had restricted my father's outside contact because I was afraid he would tell someone what was actually happening. None of these things were true, not one word, but they were specific, and specificity does a particular thing to the credibility of a claim. It signals that the person making the claim has direct knowledge, has been close enough to the situation to know the details rather than just having general concerns. Vague concerns are easy to dismiss. Specific allegations about pension checks and particular conversations and specific patterns of behavior, those feel like things someone knows because they saw them. The pension check claim was also, from Blake's perspective, strategically brilliant because it was the one claim that was almost impossible to directly disprove without access to detailed financial records that I did not have in a form that was publicly presentable. The money had gone to medications and farm operating costs, yes, and I had kept records of this, but those records were in my notebooks and in bank statements that were not the kind of thing you pull out at a community gathering to defend yourself. What I did not know, in the 3rd and 4th years, was how far the narrative had spread. Oscar told me later that by the final year before my father's death, there was essentially no one in the immediate community, no one within the social orbit of people who knew my father, who had not heard some version of the claim. Some believed it completely, some believed it partially. Some were uncertain but had absorbed enough of it to shift their behavior toward me in the ways I was noticing. None of them had ever asked me directly, which is the specific social dynamic that slander relies on. The allegation circulates in the space of private conversation, and the person being slandered is never in the room where it circulates. So the normal human mechanism of forming an opinion from multiple sources of direct information never activates. Oscar had heard the claims. He had heard them in detail. He knew they were False. He had been at the farm twice a week for 5 years. He had seen the medications. He had seen the financial reality. He had watched me work myself into genuine physical depletion to keep the farm alive. He had tried, in his quiet way, to counter the claims when he heard them directly. He had told people what he had seen, but he was telling one person at a time, in real conversations, while Blake's version was propagating through social channels, with the efficiency that false narratives have always had, moving faster and wider than corrections, because corrections require people to change their minds, which is a thing people are structurally reluctant to do. This is what I mean when I say the strategic mistake was about narrative management. If I had been attending to the community the way I was attending to the crops, if I had been managing my public presence with a fraction of the attention I was giving to the Eastfield drainage, the narrative might not have taken root before I had a chance to prevent it. Not definitely. Blake was good at this and was working with the grain of the community's natural anxieties, but possibly. The question I cannot answer is whether there was a version of those 5 years in which I did both things well, kept the farm alive, and preserved my reputation in the community. I'm not sure the bandwidth existed for both, but I think about it. The first visible sign that it had worked was a small thing that I almost dismissed. Jocelyn Nicholson, who worked at the store and who had always been warm to me when I came in for supplies, was cooler on a Tuesday morning in my third-year home. Not cold, not unfriendly, just measurably different in a way that I noticed and then told myself I was misreading because I was tired and probably becoming paranoid from isolation. A few weeks later, at a county road meeting, I noticed conversations falling shorter in my vicinity, eyes moving differently when I approached groups, an ambient reduction in the ease of exchange that had always characterized my interactions in the community. I told myself these were projections. I told myself I was looking for things that weren't there, because stress produces that kind of distorted perception. I was wrong. The things I was looking for were exactly there, but I was too busy to investigate. That is the truth of it. I was too deep in the actual work of keeping the farm alive and keeping my father cared for to have the bandwidth to monitor what was being said about me in the community, and this failure to monitor, this assumption that doing the right thing would be visible to people who were watching, was the strategic mistake that everything else exploited. If I had been paying attention, I might have had conversations. I might have corrected the record while the record was still correctable. I might have made the nature of my situation legible to people before my brothers made it illegible. I did not. I was focused entirely on the work, which is admirable in its way, but was not, in this specific situation, sufficient. My father passed away on a Thursday morning in early October of the 5th year I was home. He died in his own room, in his own bed, because I had understood from the very beginning that this was the thing he would have wanted most. Not a hospital, not a facility, not clinical surroundings with strangers, but the room he had slept in for 40 years with the window that looked over the north field and the sound of the farm in the morning. He had been unconscious for the final 36 hours. I sat with him through the night before he died, in the chair beside his bed, and I talked to him about the fields, about the plans for the spring, about the Eastfield drainage project I had finally completed, about Oscar and the way the land looked in October. I don't know with certainty whether he heard me. I continue to believe he did. I called Blake first, at 5:47 in the morning. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear him moving from sleep to wakefulness as I spoke. He was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then he said, "I'll be there today." I called Darren next. He made the same commitment. They both arrived before noon. Blake drove from Philadelphia, Darren from Pittsburgh, and for those first several hours there was a suspension that I can only describe as grief being large enough, for once, to be larger than everything else, larger than the tension and the history and the resentment, large enough to make us simply 3 men who had lost their father, standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse eating food that neighbors had brought without being asked. Blake and I went for a walk in the near field in the late afternoon. He was quiet for most of it. Then he said, "You did right by him. You should know that." I didn't respond because I didn't know how to, and because the statement felt, in that moment, like too little too late, and also like something I genuinely needed to hear, and both of those things being true simultaneously made the receiving of it complicated. The funeral was 3 days later. The community turned out completely. My father had lived in that county for 66 years, had worked that land, had been known by people and their parents, and in some cases their grandparents, and his death was felt as a community loss in the way that deaths of genuinely rooted people are felt, not just by the immediate family but by the place itself, as if the land registered the absence of someone who had known it this long and this well. I sat in the front row at the church service between my brothers, which was where we were supposed to sit, which was the arrangement that made sense, and I remember the quality of the light through the church windows that morning, the October light of Pennsylvania, and I remember trying to concentrate on the words being spoken and finding that the grief was operating at a volume that made concentration difficult. The service was what it was supposed to be. People spoke about my father with specificity and warmth. A hymn was sung that he had apparently requested, which was information I had not known, which I found painful in the way that discovering evidence of a person's inner life after their death is always painful. At the graveside, the community gathered in the particular compressed way of outdoor funerals. Everyone near enough to be appropriate, the October wind moving through the trees at the edge of the property. The words were said. The committal was done, and then people began the natural dispersal of a graveside gathering. Small conversations forming, people moving toward each other, the grief releasing into the smaller human exchanges that follow it. That is when Blake spoke. He positioned himself near enough to the main gathering that he would be heard without appearing to have staged it. I understand this now. I did not understand it in that moment, because in that moment I was 24 years old and newly bereft and not expecting the thing that was about to happen. He said, in a voice that was controlled and carried and calibrated, that he wanted the community to know something about the circumstances of their father's final years, something he had kept private out of respect, but that he now felt obligated, in the spirit of honesty, to share. I looked at him. I did not understand what was happening yet. He said that their father, in the final period of his life, had made certain decisions about the disposition of his estate that reflected his feelings about how he had been treated. He said that a document existed, a legal document, prepared properly, signed by their father, that reflected those decisions clearly. He said that the document indicated that the youngest son had been removed as a beneficiary due to conduct that their father had described in explicit terms, conduct that included financial misappropriation and abuse of a dependent. I felt the air change around me. Darren stepped forward and handed Blake papers. I saw Blake hold them up briefly, not to anyone specific, just to the gathered group, the gesture of a person displaying evidence rather than examining it. Several people near us shifted in position. I could see, in my peripheral vision, faces turning toward me. The papers claimed to be a codicil to my father's will. They had what appeared to be my father's signature. They made specific allegations that corresponded precisely to the rumors that had been circulating in the community for 2 years. The pension money, the restricted contact, the misappropriated assets. The document was, I would learn years later from a forensic examination I commissioned, a constructed instrument, a template document with my father's signature lifted from an unrelated document he had signed years earlier, likely a routine agricultural assistance form, and placed into a new context through careful scanning and reproduction. The signature was technically authentic. The document around it was not, but I did not know that standing at the graveside. I knew only what I was hearing, and what I was hearing was my 5 years described as a crime. My father's final wishes invoked to strip me of everything I had stayed to protect, and the entire community of people my father had known his entire life, standing close enough to hear every word. I could not speak. I want to say this clearly because I think people assume that silence in a moment like this is a strategic choice, a dignified restraint. It was not. I could not speak, because the gap between what I knew to be true, what I had lived through, what I had done, the nights and the mornings and the medications in the fields, and what was being presented publicly in that moment was so absolute, so total, that my brain could not bridge it fast enough to produce language. The shock was not the emotional shock of surprise. It was the cognitive shock of reality failing to correspond to itself, of two incompatible truths occupying the same space. I looked around at the people nearby. I saw the expressions I described earlier, the slow nods of people having something confirmed they had been prepared to believe, the quiet satisfaction of a narrative resolving as predicted. I saw the expression on Oscar Patterson's face, which was not one of those things, which was, in fact, a controlled anguish that I would not understand until he explained it to me years later, that said he had suspected this was coming and had not managed to stop it, and would carry that failure. I did not see any expression that could help me. Blake said I had until the end of the week to vacate the property. Darren spoke next. He said, "I want you to know that I thought about this for a long time, about what happened. I know it wasn't." He stopped. He started again. "I know you worked hard there." I looked at him. "That's not a sentence I know what to do with, Darren." He looked at his hands. Blake said, "We were in a different position back then. We were building our lives. We couldn't just—" I said, "Stop." Still level. "I'm not here to have a conversation about what you could and couldn't do. I understand the decisions you made. I understood them when you made them. What I don't need is an account of them now that reframes them as something other than what they were." I paused. "You built a story about me. You told it to everyone who knew my father. You staged a document at his graveside. Those are the facts. What you did with the farm after that is a secondary issue." Blake's jaw tightened. It was the specific tightening of a person who is receiving an accurate accounting of themselves and has no productive response to it. He said, "We thought—" I said, "I know what you thought. You thought you were protecting something that wasn't yours to protect, because you believed it should have been yours, and you had decided that your belief was sufficient justification for the action. I understand the internal logic of it. I've had 20 years to understand it. The understanding doesn't change what it was." The silence that followed that was different in quality from the earlier silences. It was the silence of a room in which one kind of conversation has been exhausted, and another kind has not yet begun. Blake looked at the table. Darren was still looking at his hands. Then Blake looked up. His expression had changed. The controlled reasonableness had gone out of it, and what was underneath it was something I had not expected. Not quite remorse, because remorse requires a level of self-examination that I was not certain Blake had done, but something that looked like recognition of a specific kind. The recognition of a man who has spent 20 years with a certain version of a story and who is encountering for the first time a version of it that is more accurate and that cannot be dismissed. He said, "What happened to the farm? Is it—" I said, "It's being restored. I've hired the right people. The fields are coming back." He nodded very slowly. "Dad would have wanted that." I said, "I know." And that was the closest thing to a real conversation we had, in that room or in any room. The rest of the meeting was logistics. My attorney walked Darren's attorney through the title transfer documents. Timelines were established. The compensation formula was explained and not challenged. The meeting ended in the specific businesslike way that legal resolutions end, not with drama, not with visible emotion, but with the signing of things and the exchanging of cards and the management of an exit. I watched them leave. Blake walked out first, slightly ahead of Darren, which had been the shape of their relationship my entire life. The door closed. I sat at the conference table for a few minutes after they left. Candace knocked once, lightly, and I told her I'd be out in a few minutes. The sparkling water bottles were still on the table, one of them open but barely touched. The folders were still arranged where they had been. The city was still behind the window, doing everything the city does. 20 years is a very long time. I understand this in the abstract, the way anyone understands the passage of time in the abstract. But sitting in that room, with the door just closed. I understood it in a different way. As volume, as weight, as the accumulated mass of all the days that had passed between the truck in the parking lot and the chair at the head of this table. The days had the weight of actual things that had happened in them. I felt that weight in a way that was not exactly comfortable, and was not exactly triumphant, and was not exactly sad. It was just real. It was just what 20 years feels like when you are finally sitting still long enough to feel it. I stood up. I put on my jacket. I picked up the folder I had brought with me, the assessment, the title documents, and I left the conference room. Candace was at her desk. She looked up with the particular expression of an assistant who can read her employer's emotional weather and who was making assessments based on what she saw. She said, "Should I move your 2 o'clock?" I said, "No, I'll be ready." I went into my office. I sat down at my desk. I looked at the Delaware River through the window for about 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Oscar Patterson. I left that afternoon. I drove away from the farm in the truck I was technically not supposed to take. There was a moment, after Blake finished speaking and before he asked me to leave, when I looked at my father's grave. I want to describe this moment because it is the one I return to most often when I think about that day. More than anything that was said, my father had been the ground for approximately 4 minutes. The soil on top of the grave was still the disturbed, loose soil of new interment, different in texture and color from the surrounding ground. The flowers that had been placed there were still fresh, not yet beginning the process of loss. The headstone was a simple granite marker that I had ordered and paid for, and that had his name and his dates and a line I had chosen from something he had said once. Good work outlasts the worker. I looked at the grave while Blake spoke. I don't know exactly why, but I think it was because the grave was the only real thing available to me in that moment. The only thing that was factually, undeniably what it was, that could not be recontextualized or reframed or turned into evidence of something it wasn't. My father was dead. The grave was there. Those two facts were stable in a way that nothing else in my field of vision was stable. When Blake asked me to leave the property, I looked at him for a moment. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the honest answer is more complicated than the simple answer. The simple answer is that I felt furious and destroyed and blindsided. All of those things were true, but under them was something stranger and colder, a recognition that what was happening had been prepared for, that the smoothness of Blake's delivery, the way Darren had the papers ready, the precision with which the claims matched the narrative I'd been sensing in the community, none of that was improvised. This had been built, and the building of it had happened while I was working 16-hour days in the fields and sitting beside a dying man and trying to keep a farm alive. And I had not seen it coming because I had not believed it was possible. That recognition that I had been completely outmaneuvered in a campaign I didn't know was happening was, in many ways, the most lasting damage of that day. Not the loss of the farm, though the farm loss was real and enormous. The loss of my basic model of how the world worked, the model in which people who watched you work every day and who saw what your life actually looked like would draw conclusions based on that observation rather than on what they had been told to conclude. That model broke at the graveside, completely and permanently. I've built a different model since. The different model is more accurate. It is also lonelier. I drove east because east was the only direction I had any knowledge of, any preparation for. Philadelphia was a city I had considered a destination once, in the life that had been interrupted. There was something in the direction itself that felt less arbitrary than the other three, as if going east was at least going toward something I had once been going toward before. The first night in the parking lot I didn't sleep. I sat in the truck and the city made its city sounds around me, and I tried to think through what had just happened with enough clarity to produce any actionable conclusion, and I could not. The grief and the shock were too large and too recent. I was 24 years old, and I had spent 5 years of my life on a piece of work that had just been publicly declared a crime, and the person I had done it for was dead, and the community I had been part of my entire life now believed I was the kind of person who steals from a sick father, and I had $47 and a truck I wasn't supposed to have. There are moments in some lives when the foundation gives way completely. Not partially, not in ways that allow for immediate rebuilding, but completely, when you are left standing on nothing, with nothing under your feet that is reliable, with nothing in any direction that constitutes ground. That parking lot was mine. The next 3 nights were mine. The question of what I would do from there had no answer yet, and I sat with that absence of answer for 3 nights and let it be what it was, because there was no alternative. I want to say something about those 3 nights that is honest, and that resists both self-pity and false toughness. Those nights were genuinely terrible. They were some of the worst of my life. Worse in certain ways than the bad years on the farm, because the farm years had purpose and momentum, and the truck had only the parking lot. But they were also, in a way I understand only with distance, necessary. The complete removal of every structural support, family, community, home, purpose, plan, was total enough that what I built afterward had to be genuinely mine, not a modified version of what I'd had, not a rebuilt version of the plan in the notebook, mine, from the absolute ground up, because there was no other ground available. That forced originality was the only useful thing the parking lot produced, but it did produce it, and that I took because I was too demolished to think clearly about what was and wasn't mine. I drove without any particular destination, the way people drive when the motion itself is the point. When stopping seems impossible, I ended up on a highway heading east, and I kept going east, because east led to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was a city I knew the road to, and a city large enough to disappear into, which was what I needed. To be no one recognizable in a place full of people who were also trying to be no one in particular. I had $47 in my wallet. I had the clothes I was wearing. I had a phone with a cracked screen and a truck that ran, but that I had no plan for beyond the next hour. I had a notebook in the truck's glove compartment with 5 years' worth of farming records that no one would ever look at. I slept in the truck for 3 nights in a parking lot near the Philadelphia city center, and I want to be honest about that because I think honesty about the actual floor of a fall is important when you're telling the story of what was built above it. 3 nights, a parking lot, $47. This is not embellishment, and it is not self-pity. It is the accurate ground-level view of where I started from. On the 4th night, I called Felix Armstrong. He answered. He had an apartment in a neighborhood called Kensington that was, at that point in the late 90s, in the early stages of a transition that had not yet arrived, which meant the rent was survivable. He had a couch. He told me to come. He did not ask questions, which I have categorized in the permanent ledger of debts I owe that man as the most generous thing he has ever done, because questions at that moment would have required me to produce words, and I did not have words. I slept on Felix's couch for 2 weeks. On day 9, I found a construction job. I found it the way you find things when you have nothing and need to move. I walked to a job site I had seen on the way through the neighborhood, found the foreman, and introduced myself as a person with construction experience and tools, knowledge who was available to start immediately. The foreman's name was Gavin Jenningson. He was a compact, weathered man who spoke in short declarative sentences and whose primary interest in any new hire was whether they showed up and whether they worked. He did not ask about my background in detail. He gave me a hard hat and pointed at a concrete form that needed assembling, and that was the beginning of the next 3 years of my life. The Henderson Building Group, which was Gavin's employer, was a mid-sized general contractor doing residential and light commercial work across the city's transitional neighborhoods. The work was physical and absorbing, which were the 2 qualities I needed most in those first months. It required enough concentration to prevent extended periods of the kind of thinking that was not yet productive, and it used the physical capacity that had been trained by 5 years of farm work in a way that made me consistently more useful than the average new hire, which Gavin noticed and which translated into slightly better assignments and slightly better pay. I lived carefully. Carefully is not a sufficient word. I lived with the kind of disciplined austerity that comes from a specific calculation, that every dollar not spent in the first year was a dollar that might be $2 in 5 years, if directed correctly. I moved from Felix's couch to a single room in a house run by a family named Darren, no relation to my brother, in a neighborhood 20 minutes from the work sites, where I rented for significantly less than any apartment would have cost because I needed a room and not an apartment, and I had been raised by a man who understood the difference between what you needed and what you thought you needed. I cooked my own food. I repaired my own clothes. I walked when the weather allowed instead of paying for transit. I did not go out socially. I did not spend money on entertainment. I did not buy things I could do without, and I did without a great many things. By the end of the first year, I had saved $4,083. By the end of the second year, I had $11,700. By the end of the third year, I had saved $22,400. $22,000 is not a fortune, but it is a foundation. It is enough to begin something, if you know exactly what to begin and exactly why. The knowledge of what to begin came from Philip Iverson. Philip was a senior crew member at Henderson, who had been in construction for 22 years when I met him, and who had, over the course of those years, done something that almost no one around him had thought to do. He had paid attention to the buildings they were building, and to the land under them, and to the neighborhoods around them, and to the prices those neighborhoods were commanding, and how those prices were changing and why. He had made, from the position of a construction worker, a series of small property investments, nothing dramatic, nothing that required capital he didn't have, that had compounded, through patience and attention and a refusal to panic at market movements, into a portfolio that was quietly substantial. Philip didn't talk about money the way wealthy people talk about money. He talked about buildings and land the way my father had talked about soil and crops, as living systems with their own cycles, their own indicators, their own patient responses to proper management. He was the first person who made me understand that the knowledge I had developed about agricultural land had a direct analog in urban real estate, that reading a field and reading a neighborhood were, at their core, the same skill applied to different substrate. I started arriving early to job sites to have time to talk to Philip before the crew arrived. He gave me the names of books. He mentioned specific aspects of the market that he watched, not the big newspaper indicators, but the granular ones, the things that changed in neighborhoods before the prices reflected them. The quality of new businesses opening on a block, the renovation patterns in housing stock, the school enrollment trends, the infrastructure investment signals from the city budget. He talked about timing and patience with a consistency that I recognized immediately as the same thing my father had talked about. When he talked about the land, Philip and I had a specific conversation about 6 months into our working relationship at Henderson that I can reconstruct almost word for word because it reoriented everything that followed. I had asked him about a neighborhood we were working in, whether he thought the development pattern we were contributing to was sustainable, whether the prices would hold. He gave me a 20-minute answer that was more sophisticated than anything I had read in the library, because it was not theoretical. It was the product of 20 years of watching the same dynamics play out repeatedly from inside the market. Pattern recognition developed through direct observation rather than through textbooks that described market behavior from the outside looking in. He said at one point, "The thing most people miss is that they're looking at what's happening. You have to be looking at what's about to happen. The prices you see today are already the news. You want the thing that's not news yet." He was describing exactly what my father had described when he talked about reading the land. The difference between observation and anticipation, between reacting to conditions and positioning yourself in advance of them, between looking at the crop that's already growing and reading the soil for what the next season would produce. I said, "My father used to say something similar about farming." Philip looked at me with what I now understand was a recalibration of his assessment of who I was. He said, "You grew up farming?" I said yes. He said, "Good. then you already understand the most important thing about this business. Most people who come to real estate have to learn what land actually is. You already know. He was right, and the knowing turned out to be more transferable than I had expected. The capacity to read soil quality, to understand yield variability across a field, to think about a piece of land not as a static object, but as a productive system with its own cycles and its own responses to management. All of it mapped directly to urban real estate, if you could perform the translation. I could. That conversation with Philip was the first time since the graveside that I understood something about myself as an asset rather than a remnant. That the difference between the farmer who thrives and the farmer who merely survives is the ability to read cycles that are longer than a single season. I began reading in the evenings, not casually, not as entertainment, but with the specific, directed attention of a person who is building a body of knowledge for a purpose. I went to public library branches after work. The city had a good library system, and I used it comprehensively. And I read about property valuation, about real estate investment structures, about zoning law, about tax implications, about mortgage mechanics, about the history of Philadelphia's neighborhood development cycles. I read about construction from the investor's side as well as the worker's side, which gave me a perspective that very few people on either side of that divide actually had. I read about the specific mechanics of how a piece of land moves from one state of development to another, what it takes financially, legally, operationally, and I tracked the gaps in that process that represented opportunity. In my 4th year in Philadelphia, with $22,000 saved and 18 months of self-education in the real estate market behind me, I made my first investment. Philip had identified a row house in a neighborhood that he assessed to be approximately 22 months behind the improvement curve that was sweeping through a connected series of neighborhoods to its west. The property was in poor condition, not structurally compromised, but cosmetically neglected, which meant it was priced at a discount relative to what it would be worth with the work done. The price was $31,000. Philip's stake would be roughly equal to mine. I spent 3 months studying the deal before committing. I walked the neighborhood at different times of day and different days of the week. I tracked the prices of comparable properties in the preceding neighborhoods over the previous 3 years. I consulted with Philip about every assumption in our projection. I visited the property 4 times, including once with a contractor who gave me a detailed repair estimate. When I had stress-tested every assumption I could think of and the numbers still made sense, I committed the money. $15,000 of my 22 was in that deal. The remaining 7 was everything. If the deal failed, I was starting again from close to nothing, which was a position I had already been in once and had no desire to revisit. The deal did not fail. 17 months after purchase, we sold the property at a price that returned my initial investment, plus $19,000. My total net worth went from $7,000 in reserve to approximately $34,000. $34,000 is still not a fortune, but it is twice what I'd had, and the process of earning it had taught me things that tripled its value as a foundation. I repeated the process. Not immediately. I waited 4 months before the next investment, using the time to study a different part of the market, to identify a neighborhood where the same dynamics were operating at an earlier stage. The second investment was larger, $22,000 into a 2-family property that Philip and I would hold as a rental for 18 months before selling. I managed the rental myself, learning the landlord side of the operation through direct experience rather than theory. The third investment I made alone, without Philip, the first time I had taken that step, and the first test of whether the knowledge was actually mine or borrowed. It was mine. The profit was modest, but it was entirely the product of analysis I had done independently, which had a value beyond its dollar amount. By 30, I was ready to move from the outside of real estate development to the inside. I left Henderson Building Group with a letter of reference from Gavin Jenningson that was not long on words, but was very specific about what I had demonstrated over 3 years of work. I joined a development company as a project coordinator, an entry-level role that paid less than I had been making on a construction crew, but that placed me inside the organizational structure of a development operation, where I could learn how the whole machine worked from a position adjacent to its working parts. The company was run by Adrian Bennetson, who was in his mid-50s, whose biography included building a real estate operation in the 80s, losing it in the early 90s market correction, rebuilding it through the mid-90s, and arriving at a point of relative stability and hard-won perspective that made him, in my view, a better teacher than someone who had only ever succeeded. He hired me after I showed him my investment portfolio in the interview, an unconventional move that I had considered carefully before making, understanding it could go wrong if read as boastful, but that I was betting would be read, by a person like Adrian, as evidence of something he valued. He read it correctly. He told me 6 months into my time at the firm that he had hired me because anyone at my income bracket who had built that portfolio in that time frame without formal credentials was either very lucky or extraordinarily disciplined, and that the way I had talked about the investments in the interview made it clear it wasn't luck. I worked for Adrian for 4 years. They were the most difficult 4 years of my professional development, not because the work was harder than construction or farming. It wasn't, but because it required sustained intellectual engagement at a level of complexity that was genuinely new to me, and because Adrian was demanding in the specific way of a man who wants the people around him to be better than they currently are, and has no interest in protecting them from that aspiration. He taught me deal structuring, how a development project is financed from multiple sources, how risk is allocated between equity and debt, how the timing of those components affects the entire operation. He taught me how regulatory relationships work in practice, not in theory, but in the actual, specific, often slow and frustrating practice of moving a development through zoning and permitting and community approval processes that have their own logic and their own key relationships. He taught me how to read a pipeline of projects, how to assess which are likely to close, which are likely to fall, and how to position the business so that the inevitable failures don't collapse the whole structure. And he taught me, through a specific mistake I made in the 3rd year, something I would not have fully understood without experiencing it. The mistake was this: I needed to increase my ownership stake in the company, which required capital I didn't yet have, and I approached a private lender too quickly. The lender was a man named Noliner Henderson, who operated independently in the city's private investment community, and who offered terms that looked aggressive but manageable to me as I read them. What I had not read carefully enough, and I want to say this plainly as a warning rather than an excuse, was a clause that defined certain market conditions as grounds for the lender to accelerate the loan repayment demand. The clause was written broadly enough to give him meaningful discretion in how he defined those conditions, and I had not asked what that discretion looked like in practice. 8 months after I signed the agreement, Noliner exercised the clause. The market condition he cited was real, but its application to my situation was a stretch that his legal team's drafting had made technically defensible. I needed to produce $60,000 in 90 days, or default on the loan. I spent 90 days in a state of controlled emergency. I sold 2 properties, both good properties, both that I had intended to hold, at prices that reflected the time pressure I was under, which is to say at prices below what they would have achieved if I'd had any negotiating room at all. I covered the loan, I retained the stake, but I lost. Approximately 2 years of asset accumulation in those 90 days, and I lost them because I had read a contract the way I wanted it to be, rather than the way it was. The lesson was not to avoid debt. The lesson was to read every clause in a financial agreement as if it were written by someone who has a specific scenario in mind in which they intend to use it against you, because sometimes it was. And the only defense against that scenario is to know the clause better than the person who wrote it. I spent my 30s building. That is the simplest and most accurate summary. I completed the buyout of Adrian's company at 35 through a structure he designed, and that was generous without being imprudent, and I renamed the firm and expanded it with a deliberateness that reflected everything I had learned about the cost of moving faster than your infrastructure can support. I hired Heather Patterson in my second year as sole owner, and she became in the years that followed the most important professional relationship of my career. Not because she agreed with me, but because she disagreed with me in ways that were specific and defensible, and that turned out, in the cases where we tested them, to be right more often than not. By 38, I had 17 full-time employees and a pipeline of active development projects across 3 states. By 42, the pipeline exceeded $60 million in project value. By 45, I had completed a series of larger deals that repositioned the firm in the market as a significant player in mixed-use urban development, which is a specific and demanding niche that rewards exactly the combination of skills I had built over 15 years of learning: engineering knowledge, agricultural instinct for land value, construction experience from the inside, and the financial discipline of a person who has learned what it costs to get the math wrong. The building I owned and worked from was on the 42nd floor of a tower in central Philadelphia with a view of the Delaware River that I had earned the right to by doing the work in the right order, which is the only order that produces a view like that with any meaning behind it. And then the letter came. Oscar Patterson had found me through a search effort that he described, when I later asked him to walk me through it, with the mild pride of a man who has accomplished something he wasn't sure he could accomplish. He had known I had gone to Philadelphia. He had known I had worked in construction. He had used those 2 facts and a series of inquiries that he described as asking around to the right people over approximately 3 years, until a conversation at the County Agricultural Association had produced a name that led to a conversation that led to my firm's address. He had written the letter by hand because, he said, some things should not be typed. 3 pages. His handwriting slightly trembling but completely legible. The handwriting of a man who learned to write when handwriting was taught, with the seriousness of a skill that would be used for life. He described what had happened to the farm after I left. Blake and Darren had assumed joint ownership through the documents they had presented at the graveside, and that assumption had been accepted by the county because no one had contested it, because I had simply driven away and no challenge had been filed. They had farmed the property for approximately 2 years, without particular competence, before shifting to a minimal management model in which some fields were rented at below-market rates to neighboring operations while others were left fallow. They had taken 2 loans against the property. Darren had eventually bought Blake out of his share. Details of that transaction Oscar was not privy to, and Blake had returned to Philadelphia and, from what Oscar understood, moved into something in the insurance industry. Darren had remained on the property. He had continued to mismanage it, spending money from the loans on improvements that were never completed, selling equipment at losses that compounded the financial pressure, allowing the land to degrade in ways that would require substantial remediation. The farm was now being offered for sale, not through a public listing, but through a real estate intermediary who was quietly identifying institutional buyers, development corporations with interest in converting agricultural land to residential use. The final paragraph of Oscar's letter said, "I thought you should know. I thought you should be the one to decide what happens to it. Your father would have wanted that." I sat with the letter for a week. I kept it on my desk and returned to it every morning before anything else. Not because I was uncertain about what I wanted to do, that part was clear, but because I understood that what I was considering was not a simple business decision, and that I needed to give the non-simple parts of it their proper weight before moving. I wanted the farm back. That was not in question. I wanted it back not as a business proposition, though the financial case for acquiring degraded agricultural land at below market value and restoring it properly was sound on its own merits. I wanted it back because it was my father's land, because I had worked that land, because my father had taught me on that land the only things I have ever understood at the deepest level, because the East Field still had the irrigation infrastructure I had installed 20 years before, and the creek still ran along the south edge, and the porch still leaned to the left, and none of those things belonged in the hands of the kind of people who had treated them as commodities to be extracted. I instructed my legal team to research the property. They traced the title history, confirmed the chain of ownership, and identified the intermediary that Darren had engaged to find a buyer. They also found the connection I had half expected to find. The development corporation that was the leading interested buyer was a Pittsburgh-based firm, the kind of firm that converted agricultural land to residential subdivisions, the kind of transaction that would have been, to my father, a form of desecration. I asked my team to contact the intermediary and indicate that our firm was interested in the property and wished to arrange a direct meeting with the owner. I specified that the meeting should be held in our offices in Philadelphia. I asked that my name not be disclosed in advance. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in early November. I prepared for it the way I prepared for every significant meeting, which is to say completely, thoroughly, without leaving anything to improvise that could be known in advance. I had a full property assessment commissioned. I had the title history reviewed by our legal team. I had the forensic document analysis that I had commissioned 2 years earlier, after I had enough money to commission it and enough curiosity to want the confirmation, reviewed and summarized by the analyst. That analysis had concluded, with high probability, that the signature on the graveside document had been extracted from another context and placed into the codicil by reproduction methods, not applied fresh to the final document. It was not courtroom definitive evidence. The passage of time and the quality of the reproduction made absolute certainty impossible, but it was, in the assessment of the analyst and our attorney, sufficient to generate serious legal scrutiny if presented appropriately. I was at the office by 8 in the morning. I went through the assessment, the title history, the legal summary. I had 2 separate conversations with our lead attorney about how the meeting might unfold and what our options were in each scenario. I asked Candace, my assistant, to see the guests impersonally when they arrived, to offer the sparkling water, and to give me 60 seconds of lead time before she opened the conference room door. I was standing at the window when the door opened. I heard them come in. I heard them settle into the chairs. I heard the pause as they oriented themselves in the room. And then I turned. Blake had changed in the way that 20 years change everyone. Gray, heavier, the face settled into a version of itself that age produces whether you want it to or not. Darren was thinner and more tired-looking, the specific tiredness of a man who has been managing anxiety for a long time and has run out of the energy to hide it. They looked at me with the initial blankness of people looking at a stranger, and then the recognition moved across Blake's face in layers. The first layer shock, the second layer disbelief, the third layer something that might have been fear. I let the silence sit. Not as theater. I want to be clear about that. I need you to understand it was not performance. It was because the moment needed to be real for them before anything was said, because everything that followed depended on them understanding with complete certainty where they were and who was across the table from them. I said, "Sit down." They were already sitting. Blake said, "I don't," and stopped. I said, "You do." 30 seconds of silence. The city outside continuing its indifferent existence, the water untouched, the folders on the table. Darren said, "We didn't know you were..." I said, "I know you didn't know. That was the point. I wanted you to find out exactly here." Blake put his hands flat on the table in the gesture of a man establishing that he is calm, that he is reasonable, that this situation can be discussed rationally. He said, "There are things from back then that can be explained. There were misunderstandings." I said, "Stop." I said it without raising my voice. There were no misunderstandings. You built a narrative for 2 years. You delivered it at the graveside. I have the forensic analysis of the document you showed that day. I know exactly what it is and what was done to produce it. I have had that analysis for 2 years. I waited for the right moment. Darren looked at his hands. Blake absorbed this information with the specific, controlled reaction of a person processing a serious threat while trying not to show that the threat has landed. Blake said, So what happens now? I looked at him across the table and I allowed myself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what I was looking at. Not triumph, not the satisfaction I'd imagined on certain late nights over 20 years. Something more complicated and more honest than that. Something like grief for who we might have been to each other and who we were. Something like recognition of everything that had been spent to arrive at this table. Then I said it. What happens now is that you leave, not just this meeting, the farm, you transfer the title. My legal team has the documents prepared. Your attorneys can review them. I'm giving you 30 days. You will receive fair compensation, which I define as current assessed land value, minus the degradation that occurred under your management, calculated by an independent assessor, we will both agree on. The number will not be negotiated beyond that formula. After the transfer is complete, you leave my life, you leave the farm, you never return to that land. There was silence. Then Darren said, quietly, "That's the family farm." I said, "I know what it is. I worked that farm for 5 years. I sat with our father through the night before he died. I held his hand. I talked to him about the East Field. I made sure he was in his own bed in his own room, because I understood what he would have wanted. You know all of that, so don't tell me about the family farm. Don't tell me what it is." Darren stopped. Blake said after a moment, "And if we refuse?" I said, "Then the forensic analysis is filed with the county attorney's office along with a civil complaint. The fraud case is opened. The statute of limitations has complicated the picture, but not in a direction your attorney will enjoy explaining to you. The process will take several years and will be public throughout, and the record at the end of it will be specific about what was done, who did it, and why. I will make certain of that." I paused. "I would prefer the other resolution, not for your sake, for the land's sake." Blake looked at Darren. Darren looked at the table. The city went on outside the window. The papers were signed 3 weeks later. Their attorney requested a higher compensation figure. My attorney shared the forensic analysis in a private meeting. They accepted the formula. I drove to the farm on the first morning after the title transferred. I left Philadelphia at 4 a.m, which is when I wake up on most days, regardless of necessity, and I arrived at the property as the early light was beginning to distinguish the fields from the sky. That first pale differentiation, the landscape assembling itself out of darkness the way it does in October in Pennsylvania, gradual and specific. I stood at the gate for a long time. The house needed significant work. The barn needed more. The fields that had been fallow were already showing the beginning of natural recovery. Land is patient with people, more patient than people deserve. But they would need remediation and time. The East Field still had my irrigation infrastructure, 2 decades old, rusted in the fittings but structurally intact. The south fence along Oscar's property line was in reasonable condition because Oscar had maintained his side, and the general condition had held through adjacent care. The porch still leaned to the left. I walked the entire 230 acres that morning. Every inch of it, the way I had walked it as a teenager, the way I had walked it every day for 5 years. The creek was exactly where it had always been along the southern edge. The sound of it, the same specific sound I had not heard for 20 years, and recognized immediately, the way you recognize things that formed early enough in your life to be constitutive rather than remembered. The light in the low fields was the same, the slope of the land was the same. The particular feeling of the ground under my feet in the north section, where the clay content is higher and the soil compresses differently, was the same. I came around to the south end, where Oscar's fence line met ours, and he was standing on his side of the fence. He was 83 years old, and he was standing there as if he had been waiting, which I believe he had been, as if he had known the morning I would come, and had arranged himself accordingly. We looked at each other across the fence. We shook hands over it. He said, "Good." I said, "I'm going to fix it." He said, "I know you are." That was the conversation. It was the most complete conversation of my adult life. I spent the following year on the restoration. I hired an agricultural land restoration specialist named Erica Davidson, who had worked with degraded farmland across the Northeast and who understood both the ecological and economic dimensions of what was needed, that the land was not just a resource to be productive, but a system to be healthy, and that those two goals required different approaches on different timescales. We built a 5-year restoration plan. We identified the fields that needed the most remediation first. We sourced the heritage varieties of crops my father had grown, not for sentimentality's sake, though sentimentality was present, because those varieties were suited to the particular soil composition of our land in a way that more commercially common varieties were not. I hired a farm manager to live on the property and run daily operations. His name was Mason Lee Goodman, a man in his 40s who had grown up farming in the next county and who had the specific practical intelligence of someone who has spent 30 years solving problems with available materials rather than ideal ones. He was not a romantic about farming. He was a person who understood exactly what good management of a piece of land looked like and who wanted to practice it. I trusted him almost immediately, which is not my default setting, and which I attribute in part to the fact that he reminded me, in manner, not in appearance, not in circumstances, of my father. The house I restored with care and with the specific discipline of respecting what was there. The original wide plank floors were salvaged and refinished where possible, replaced with matching material where not. The windows were restored to their original proportions. The kitchen was updated with the practical upgrades my father would have approved of, and none of the decorative upgrades he would have found incomprehensible. The porch was rebuilt by a carpenter I instructed specifically to replicate its proportions, including the lean to the left. The carpenter asked me twice if I was sure. I was sure. Some things should stay exactly as they were. Some imperfections are the record of something real, of time, of weather, of people who built and lived and aged and loved a place imperfectly and genuinely. The lean in that porch was my father's porch. It was my grandmother's porch before that. I was not going to make it level, because a level porch was never what it had been. I planted a white oak on the property in the fall of the year. The farm was transferred. I planted it in the north field, in the area where my father used to begin his mornings, the slight rise at the northeast corner of the field, where you could see the farthest in 3 directions. White oaks can live for hundreds of years if the land around them is cared for. I thought he would have found that appropriate. The tree and the land in the same sentence, cared for together, growing toward a future neither of them would see fully. I did not move back to the farm. I want to be honest about this because I think it matters to the story. The farm is not where I live. Philadelphia is where I live. The company is in Philadelphia. The people I work with and care for professionally are in Philadelphia. The farm is where I go, monthly now, sometimes more. And it is the property I will never sell, the property that will be in the management plan I am developing with our estate attorney to ensure it remains farmland in perpetuity. But it is not my daily life, and to pretend otherwise would be to make the story into something tidier than it is. The long-term psychological cost is the last thing I want to tell you about, because I think it is the most important thing and the most consistently omitted thing in stories like this. I am 51 years old. I am not married. I came close once with a woman named Teresa Montgomeryson, who I was with for almost 4 years in my late 30s, and who was one of the most extraordinary people I have known. She was direct and funny and genuinely wise in the practical sense, and she understood more about me than most people have gotten close enough to understand. She told me, at the end of those 4 years, in the specific sadness of a person who has been honest with themselves long enough to be honest with you, that she could not build a shared life with someone who had not finished building himself. She did not say it as a criticism. She said it as an accurate observation and a sad one. She was right. I told her she was right. I did not ask her to stay. I think about her sometimes with a kind of tenderness that is also a kind of grief, and I have come to believe that the capacity to hold those two things simultaneously without trying to resolve them into something cleaner, is actually a form of maturity, though it took me years to stop reading it as failure. The farm years changed how I allow people near me. This is not a simple statement. It is the accurate description of something structural. When you are publicly accused of something you did not do in the community where you grew up, when the people around you choose the narrative over the evidence of your daily, visible life, something in how you understand the relationship between trustworthiness and safety gets permanently recalibrated. I work at this. I am aware of it. I have been in therapy for parts of my 50s because someone I respected told me that awareness without engagement is just informed suffering. The engagement has been useful, but the recalibration is there, and it is mine, and it will continue to require managing for the rest of my life. Felix is still in my life. He is now the CFO of a logistics company in the city, and has the wife and the proximity to family he always described wanting at 18, which I think is the most satisfying kind of adult outcome, the one where the person you were at 18 would recognize and approve of the person you became. He calls me every 2 or 3 weeks, and we talk about nothing particular and everything important, and his steadiness has been one of the consistent resources of my adult life. Heather Patterson has been with the firm for 15 years. She is one of the most reliable people I know. Oscar Patterson is 87 and still on his property, and still calls me on Sunday mornings to talk about the farm, about what's growing and how the fields are coming along, about whether the April flood was worse or better than expected. The East Field, by the way, is producing well. The heritage varieties have reestablished over 3 seasons of restoration work. The irrigation infrastructure I installed 20 years ago has been upgraded and extended. The creek flooded this past April exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. I want to return for the last time to the conference room because I described it at the beginning, and I want to close the circle accurately. From outside, the moment reads as triumph. A man who was wronged, who rose, who faced his wrongdoers from a position of absolute superiority, who won. Those facts are correct. I won. I need to say that plainly because stories that soften this out of false modesty are dishonest. I won. The farm is mine. The company is mine. The $47 and the truck and the couch and the library branches and the construction sites and the properties and the mistakes and the nights and the mornings were all in service of a return to that room that I did not plan, but that I did not shy away from when it came. But what winning felt like from inside that moment was not triumph. It was complicated and sad and real in the way that only things built from 20 years of actual cost feel real. It was grief for who my brothers and I might have been to each other in a different version of the story. It was recognition of everything that could not be undone. My father's last years, my mother's early departure, the 5 years of work that was turned into a crime before it could become a memory. It was the awareness, very clear and very quiet, that the moment I had imagined abstractly over 20 years was simultaneously exactly what I had wanted, and absolutely not what I had thought it would feel like. That is the honest version of it. I won. It changed me permanently. The winning and the changing happened at the same time and through the same process, and you cannot have one without the other, and I would not undo it if I could, and it cost more than I can fully account for. I've told you the whole story. I hope it was worth your time. Put in the comments what you would have done in that conference room. Not the idealized version, the real one. What you actually think you would have said to 2 people who took 20 years from you and who are now sitting across a table with nowhere left to go. I want to know. I have been curious about that question for a long time. And if you have ever built something from nothing after losing everything, tell me about it. Because the people who have done that are the only ones who understand what the building actually costs, and I am always interested in it, an honest accounting. I want to say something about regret, because I think it is one of the most misunderstood emotions in the context of stories like this. People often expect the protagonist of a redemption narrative to arrive at the end without regret, to declare that every hardship was worth it, that they wouldn't change anything, that the suffering was the price of the lesson and the lesson was worth the price. I am not going to tell you that because it is not true, and I think it is important not to say untrue things about experience. I have regret, specific regret, about specific things, not generalized regret about the shape of my life. I regret that I was not paying attention to the community campaign while it was happening, not because I could certainly have stopped it, but because I owed it to myself to try, and I was too exhausted and too absorbed in the work to try. That's a failure I carry. I regret the years with Teresa Montgomeryson. Not that I had them. Those years contained real things, real connection, real care, but that I was not capable, when I had them, of being fully present in the way she needed and deserved. I was present for the work. I was present for the problems. I was not always present in the unstructured ways that relationships require, the ways that don't have tasks attached to them, that are just two people being fully available to each other without an agenda. That kind of presence was hard for me. It remains hard. I am working on it. I regret sometimes, in a specific and private way, that I don't often allow myself to stay in for long, that I never found the words to tell my father what those years with him actually meant to me. Not the general words. I think he knew, in the general sense, that I loved him and was committed to the farm and to him. But the specific words, the inventory of what he had given me in those evening conversations, in those mornings on the tractor, in the 30 years worn armrests of his chair. I have had those words for years. He died before I had them. That is the kind of thing that simply sits in you, permanent and unresolvable, and you learn to carry it rather than resolve it, because there is no resolution available. I do not regret going home. I want to be clear about that because I think the shape of the story might suggest otherwise. I do not regret a single day of those 5 years, not even the worst of them. What happened to those years afterward, the way they were taken and turned against me, that I regret with a clarity that has not diminished. But the years themselves were mine, and they were real, and they were the best work I have ever done. I also do not regret the conference room. Some people, when I have described that meeting, have asked if it felt hollow, if the confrontation, when it finally came, was less than what 20 years of imagining it had led me to expect. The honest answer is that it was different rather than less. It was realer than I had imagined, which is a different thing from hollow. The brothers across the table were older men who had degraded the land and accumulated debts and run out of options. The meeting was not between a triumphant version of me and a villainous version of them. It was between the actual people we had become, with the actual history between us, and actual documents on the table, and actual consequences following from what was decided. That is not less than what I had imagined. It is more true than what I had imagined, and I have spent my life developing a preference for true over satisfying. The farm is the last thing I want to say about cost, because I think people might read the farm's restoration as a resolution, as the thing that closes the wound and heals the loss and makes the story complete. It does not do that. The farm is a place I love and that I care for and that connects me to my father and to his father and to the particular piece of earth that made me who I am. But it is not a cure. It is not a completion. It is a responsibility and a gift, and I hold it as both. And the holding of it costs me something on a regular basis in ways that are entirely worth that cost. The creek floods every April. This is not a metaphor. It is a fact about drainage topography that I chose not to correct when I had the farm restored, because correcting it would have meant rerouting water that had run that way for hundreds of years, and some things should not be changed because they are inconvenient. My farm manager finds this slightly maddening. I find it entirely correct. My father would have found it entirely correct. The creek floods in April because that is what it does, and the farm accommodates it because that is what the farm does, and we plan around it because that is what we do, and this arrangement has been working for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. That is, I think, the closest I can come to a summary of the whole story. The arrangement works. It has always worked, and it requires that we accommodate the things that cannot be changed rather than fighting them. The creak, the porch that leans, the grief that surfaces at 4 a.m, the specific wait of 20 years, the permanent rewiring that survival produces. None of these things are problems to be solved. They are the conditions of the life I have, and the life I have is the one I built. And I built it from what I had, and what I had was exactly, and only, what the parking lot and the hard hat and the library and the evenings with Philip and the deals and the mistakes and the phone call and the grant and the title transfer left me with after everything else had been taken away. It was enough. It is enough. It is, in fact, considerably more than enough. Thank you for listening.